was thinking lately how my opinions of Spy Family and Chainsaw Man have completely flipped over the past couple of years, because those of you who were sticking with the channel like over the past several years know that initially I was very keen on Chainsaw Man. I was very into it. I thought it was like one of the best mangas I've ever seen. I like really adored the first 5, 6, 7, 8 volumes or so. But very quickly, shockingly quickly, the nuance became hackneyed. It became like trite. It became silly. It became ridiculous. Chainsaw Man fell off. On the other hand, you have Spy Family, which I initially dismissed as like not being complex enough, not having a deep enough narrative, not taking itself seriously, being more of a comedy series than an action series. I was very critical of Spy Family at first, but over time, especially over the last 2 volumes, I've come to think of it as like one of my all-time favorite series because of how it handles its subject matter, because of the values it promotes, and because of just how high quality the series has been throughout its run. In other words, like Chainsaw Man fell off while Spy Family simply gets better and better and builds off of its initial concept to the point where it's kind of amazing, honestly. It's gotten me thinking about something that, we as in the anime community kind of do quite often. We assume that something being dark and edgy automatically makes it better. Like another example I can think of is, One Punch Man versus Watchmen, right? One Punch Man is like one of the greatest superhero stories of all time, while Watchmen is complete slop. When you really take a moment to analyze like why people love Watchmen, why people think it's serious literature, which is a complete meme, by the way. Why people think Watchmen is some hugely influential thing, why Alan Moore is such a great writer. He's not. Name something other than V for Vendetta and Watchmen that he's done. Name an actual book he's written, because nobody who glazes Alan Moore seems to know anything about like his actual novels that he's published. When you really look into why people love Watchmen, it always goes down to the same thing: the idea that it's dark and edgy, and that it was a refreshing change of pace to like the very cheesy, upbeat, straightforward superhero stories of the 70s and 80s, right? Watchmen was seen as a more adult superhero story, which is what, made it so appealing to man-children and people who still read comics in their 30s. Watchmen, to these people, was this sign that the medium was, like, developing an identity, that it was being taken more seriously, that, they had more artistic value. None of which was true, by the way, because in a lot of ways, Watchmen is quite a bit worse than mainstream superhero comics. It's because I think at its core, Alan Moore and Watchmen simply have no respect for the superhero medium. They aren't able to understand, like, the core appeal of this series is the core appeal of the genre of like extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. It has to be some like weird, woke, subversive nonsense to it. Like everyone's weird, everyone's a degenerate, everyone's like a pedophile, everyone's just a terrible person. And it's so interesting seeing something like One Punch Man, which does the exact opposite, where it showcases all these different people, all these different characters with their different backgrounds, their abilities, their power sets, and yet, a lot of them show the goodness and nobility of heroism. Like, obviously, if you're a superhero, you're going out and doing good things. If you're not doing that, you're simply not a superhero. And that's the problem with series like Watchmen, like The Boys, any of these, Invincible. It's just the core idea fundamentally does not work, because without acts of genuine heroism, the genre completely falls flat and it doesn't mean anything. It is just a woke subversion of a concept that genuinely draws people in. And if people thought about these series like in any way critically, that would be a lot more obvious. But we're in this weird period where, people are starving for, like, variety in comic books, and they're starving for things with, like, actual linear story structure, where there are actual consequences and things just don't get rebooted all the time, like with Marvel and DC. So they do this thing where they're just like, okay, it has to be dark and gory, and it has to be mean-spirited, and everyone has to be an asshole. It's immature and doesn't actually tell a very good story. Like The Boys comic books are a very good example where, like, the entire series is just making some well-known, well-loved superhero into, like, some lunatic or a pervert, like, over and over and over again. That's what the entire series boils down to, really. Like, there's no thought put into it, there's no consideration, there's no, like, satirical elements. Like, it's just some dipshit with no regard for what people actually want to read about, just trying to lampoon, like, iconic comic book characters with their own history, with their own legacy that will be around long after his shitty parody series is forgotten. It's very interesting kind of thinking about it from this perspective, seeing this happen with manga, because Chainsaw Man kind of is in the same position right now, where there's nothing really all that deep or complex about modern Chainsaw Man, where the series has, like, not really progressed after a certain point, and yet, like, like, Fujimoto has done everything he possibly can to, like, shock people with nonsense, like, he's basically an incel who's never really grown past the idea that, like, having sex will fix all of his problems. Okay, and that's kind of the core issue with Chainsaw Man as a concept, in that, like, it does very accurately get across, like, the incel mindset and the incel desire and the incel kind of, like, worldview, right? Like, it gets that initial concept very well, but it's never able to move past that, Like, Denji is not in the position where he can be considered an incel, because, if he's actually going on dates, if he actually has, like, friends, if he actually, like, has relationships with other people, like, he's not in that position anymore. And, like, the narrative just can't seem to accept that fact, that Denji naturally would start to understand that, having sex is not going to fix his problems, and that there's more important things in life, right? Like, the simple fact of the matter is that the character can't evolve because Fujimoto can't evolve. Fujimoto, at his core, is like an immature edgelord who doesn't understand that series don't need to be dark and edgy in order to be compelling. Like, I noticed this when I read Fire Punch, too, where, like, Fire Punch is actually worse than Chainsaw Man in this regard, actually, where it's just, the entire series is just tries to be as bleak as possible, even though it doesn't make any sense. Like, there is no ice witch, and the entire world is going to freeze over, and there's nothing you can possibly do. It's like, that contradicts everything we were told from when, like, the series started. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't come off like a plot twist. It comes off like some completely delusional, being overly bleak, like trying to get a reaction out of people, like having that scene where, like, the guy, like, wants, like, his dogs to rape, like, little girls. It's like, come on. Like, really? Fucking really? It's so, you just can't possibly take it seriously in that regard. And that's kind of my mindset, looking at, like, a lot of series that, like, a lot of neckbeards go on and on about, like Watchmen, like Warhammer 40K. Like, these aren't dark series. These aren't well-written series. And I keep seeing people, like, say that, like, well, it's dark, so it has to be, like, realistic and like, complex, and it's just, it's not really. Like, that's the thing that I'm noticing more and more as I get older, as I read stuff like Spy Family, is that Spy Family is more complex than Chainsaw Man. Spy Family is actually able to have reoccurring characters. It's actually able to develop those reoccurring characters. it's actually able to advance the plot. I keep seeing people complain that like Spy Family doesn't have a plot, and that's just completely delusional. Like, the plot is so well told that a lot of people don't even realize that when it's advancing. But you see stuff like that. You see Spy Family, and you see like how well it's doing compared to Chainsaw Man, where it fell off a long time ago. And, like, you see stuff like this, and like you really do feel as if like a certain subsection of like the consumer base just can't understand that being dark doesn't mean that it's good. Like that's kind of my mindset. Looking at this series right now, like kind of as I develop my own brands, actually. A lot of people have this mindset that like, whoa, like you have to be overly dark in order to be taken seriously, and that just simply isn't true. And it's something that I do think we really do need to talk about going forward. As we like analyze where like Chainsaw Man went wrong, that this series did try to be too bleak. This series did try way too hard to take itself seriously, when in actuality it would have been better off just being more natural, being more organic, actually telling a real story instead of just spinning its wheels for 20 volumes, right? Like, this is a series that really should have ended after part 1. There was no real reason to continue it after that. All the plot threads had been resolved. The core character conflict had ended, and yet like they kept going after that because like, this isn't the end, and yet like nothing's happened. Like, that's kind of my mindset. Looking at Chainsaw Man at this point is that like it is a zombie franchise, coasting by on like its initial hype and publicity, and like a lot of its fans don't really want to accept it. It's kind of like Bleach in that regard, where there was this very noticeable decline over time, but because of like how it exploded onto the scene, the core audience just doesn't want to accept it and just consumes it every week. Like, just wait, like Fujimoto's gonna cook eventually. Like, it's a joke, like it's remarkable how bad Chainsaw Man's gotten, and it's equally remarkable how a lot of the same people like are very much against the idea of Spy Family being successful, purely based on this idea that the series is not plot-driven enough, that it doesn't take itself seriously enough, that it's not action-based enough, that it's not dark enough, when in actuality, I think those qualities are what makes it an exceptional manga. Probably the best of the decade so far. I can't think of anything I've read that this decade that's as good as Spy Family. So when you take that into consideration, like, we do need to start acknowledging why Spy Family is taking off the way it does, why it appeals to so many people, why so many people are seething about it. And it is entirely because it promotes family values. It promotes traditionalism. It promotes having children. It kind of debunks a lot of a notions that Chainsaw Man promotes, like this idea that like, oh man, the world is doomed. Oh, why even try, bro? It's pathetic, honestly. The kind of nonsense that people like that try and push onto people, and how ready a lot of readers are to take it seriously. Like, Spy Family is very, very interesting in that regard, because I think in a lot of ways, like, Twilight and Yor have suffered a lot more than Denji ever had. Have gone through a lot more stuff, have lived a lot more full lives, and are now like kind of raising a family together. And that's something that I think Denji simply would never, as a character, would never be able to do. He's not willing or cares about taking that responsibility, and that's why the character is inherently unlikable. He wants sex and doesn't necessarily want what comes with that. Dealing with another human being, someone who actually has wants and needs of her own, and like, he doesn't really understand that. And what's more, he doesn't even want to understand that. He wants to be a simp to get a sniff of pussy his entire life, and it's there's just it's just embarrassing. Like, it's the same thing over and over and over again. There's no depth. There's no progression. There's no feeling of like Denji developing as a person, really. Like, all it is just a showcase of just how a series can coast by its reputation years after it ran out of steam. And it is like, it's SpongeBob tier, it's Fairly Odd Parents tier. Like, it does need to be understood more that Chainsaw Man has completely fallen off, while Spy Family is soaring to new heights every 2 weeks.